Okay, so let me introduce Jeff to some of you who have not met him. Most of you have seen him last year. Okay, welcome Jeff to our demo. So about Jeff, many of you have seen him as a judge for our Fall Fest show last year, and most of you have enjoyed getting to know the critiques of your work from him. Thanks for Jeff for doing a great work on critiquing all our works. Jeff has been painting from over last 40 years, and he's also, yeah, he was a demo artist last year for us, and also we did a workshop with him in acrylic. So that's how we know him quite very well. So he's been teaching also in Satin Museum. I think I messed up. So, and his artwork has been in many collections and also throughout the United States and Europe. And he's been the president of East Valley Artists Santa Clara Association, and also he's is the president of Titan Museum. And let me. And he's been a juror for many shows. So you may, if you are entered any shows, so you would have seen him as a jury for artworks, and he's very good at it. We have seen him do the great work for us last time. And so he's currently the president of Triton Museum, and also he's part of the. I'm missing out some of this. The Khalid Art Gallery. So I've seen many of the pictures from him from the Khalid Art Gallery. So if you visit the gallery next time, so you can see his work over there. With that, today, as I said earlier, Jeff is going to show the watercolor art with the painting knife. So this is very rare. I haven't seen it earlier from anyone. So this will be an awesome experience for us to see his work on how he does, and also we'll be recording this so that you can watch later. So with that, over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you very much. You switch to make this a little bit bigger here. I'm hoping that you guys get to play with this a little bit yourselves and learn to enjoy it. I started doing knife painted watercolor probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. And that was because Golden, who makes manufacturer normally makes acrylic paint, had made a new watercolor paint that was called Core, Q-O-R. And it basically had a synthetic base to it. So instead of gum arabic, it was a synthetic binder called Aquazol. And so it basically reacted the same as watercolor, could be used the same, dried on the palette a bit quicker, but it would reactivate. It doesn't reactivate quite as fast, so when you're using it as a traditional watercolor, once it's dry, you can come back in with a fairly wet wash, and because it takes a little longer for that binder to make the paint reactivate, it really helps for those of you who are watercolorists with back runs and that kind of thing. So you can use them in a traditional way, and I brought some paintings to share here for you to show you just.
Sorry, Jeff, I think I muted you by mistake. Sorry, can you unmute? Yes, yeah, can you? Yes.
Am I muted now? Good.
Yeah, yes.
Alrighty, so what we'll do here is we're going to show you this. This is actually the very first knife painted watercolor that I did, and it also was a demo several years ago now. And this is basically what the scene is part of a waterfall that is behind Grizzly Peak in Disneyland. That's where this is from. It's not up in the Sierras or anything. It's actually part of the Disneyland theme park at Grizzly Peak. And so what I did is, like I usually do, is I will start with a wash, in this case with the sky, to put the sky color in back behind there. But then I knifed in the darker aspects of the boulders and then started doing progressively lighter shades of paint on top of it, finishing up with the trees at the very end. So it's really cool if you think about this normal traditional watercolor you do from light to dark. When you're doing a knife painting, you actually do it the other way around. You do it dark to light. And you can lay it down and you can lay down all of the colors on top with just bright white on the top of it if you want to. Works really, really well. Okay, so I'll switch cameras here a little bit and I'll start sketching on this so you can see, and hopefully it'll be a little bit bigger for you to see. If I switch to speaker views, I could make me bigger or not. No, it makes you bigger. Okay, so alrighty. So this will be where we're going to start with this. This is an 11 by 15 Arches 140-pound watercolor block. And I've got a 5mm mechanical pencil here with me and a white vinyl eraser. That's all I really need to do to start in. And I'm just going to block in the very big shapes for this painting. And I'm going to hold the pencil about halfway back. Keep it very loose. And this is just to show me when I'm doing the painting where the breaks in the composition are, like where the rock is going to be, where the water is going to be, that sort of thing. There's one big slope of rock that comes up like this, comes just past the center, slopes down, comes out a little bit, slopes down and shelves again, comes down again, goes back out across here. So there's this gigantic rock shape that's here, and that's the top of it.
Hey Jeff, can you share your screen so we can see it bigger?
Yeah, let's see here. I know I tried to get it to gallery view so you should see it bigger, but
actually I pinned the video, so I'm able to see his screen bigger.
You can pin the video on your side. That makes it bigger.
Yeah, I'll try that.
Yeah, just try to pin, go to the...
yeah, because I can't enlarge it. I've tried here, so.
It's already big. If you pin it, that becomes the full screen.
That'll work.
Now again, this is just very loose pencil. I'm just breaking in where the large areas are going to be, not really blocking in a whole lot of detail here. And I'm also trying to, as I'm going along, eliminate tangents. Those of you who are landscape painter know a lot of times when you go to lay down rocks and so on, different parts of the horizon can line up with the foreground almost exactly. Another example is if you're going to take a picture of somebody and they're standing on the beach and they're wearing like a baseball cap, and the edge of the baseball cap lines up exactly with the horizon. If you take and leave the picture like that, it's going to be very flat because it looks like the horizon and the head and the cap are right across the same place on the head. And that'll flatten the painting out. So when you're doing something like this, you want to make sure that you have some of that overlap, either making it a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller so you don't have those tangents happening. Alrighty, so I'm going to start with a 1-inch brush, and I'm going to take, I'll switch the camera here, although you're probably not going to see very much here, but we'll give it a try. Okay, so I've got some manganese, some royal blue, there's some sepia, and even some Payne's gray here. And I'm going to take some of the manganese and I'm going to pull it out, and I'm going to get a very light wash of it. And like doing it with the traditional watercolor, I'm going to leave breaks in the paper. In other words, I'm not going to cover up all of the paper, just like you would do with a traditional watercolor. With regular watercolor, you always leave a little bit of the white showing through. It adds sparkle to the painting. Now here you saw the blue got a little darker. I used the same color, I just used a little bit more, so I increased the intensity of the value, made it look a little darker as it's coming forward. You can see I just basically used just manganese there on this. And when you go to the painting here, you can see what I've done here is I broke up and this is pretty much at this point almost like a traditional watercolor. Just broke up a little bit of the line. Overlaps the rocks a little bit too. So I don't have like cookie cutter when I'm done here. Now I'm not worried about completely covering up the white here because I can always come back in with white watercolor later. So I've kind of blocked in where the water is going to be on this. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a palette knife. Now this is my little diamond shaped palette knife here that I've got. I've actually got 3. And I'm going to take some of that burnt umber. Some of that dark, almost the Payne's gray actually. And I'm actually going to go ahead and start scraping in using the bottom of the blade, getting as much of the color on the bottom of the blade as I can, and then just streaking that across. Now that's going to make these rocks nice and black, or seeming black. They're actually a blackish brown color that's there. I can get my palette knife wet too, make the paint a little wetter. Some more of this out here. Use a little bit larger, thinner knife this time and cover more surface with a larger knife. Get it nice and wet.
Would you call this a palette knife or a painting knife?
This is actually a palette knife, but you can use them as a painting knife too. This one is made by RGM. They're mainly made to mix color with, but these ones that are long and flexible like this, you can use to paint with. And it'll work with acrylic, it'll work with oils, and it works with watercolor. Okay, so we'll dab some of this. I'm going to take some of that same color and I'm going to make it a little lighter. And I'm going to add some of that manganese blue that I used for the ocean. And so this background rock, I'm just going to touch in here. It's not going to be quite as stark as the rock in front of it. Some of the white show through there. And then take some of that blue and just charge it in here and there. and just let it do its thing. So I've got a background rock that's in there too. So I've got these small areas, and now I've got this big slope of rock that's coming forward here as well. The rest of this is going to be water. Now this rock comes down, there's a dark area here.
If you go ahead and unmute your go back
Now you
on.
can see this is cutting it out. It's actually covering this pretty well. I don't need to worry about spatters or anything like that because it's going to be used almost like you would use an acrylic paint at that point. You're going to be able to go ahead and just lay the paint in very, very thickly. So the next, while this is drying a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go just above where it already is just blank paper. I'm going to try to get these edges nice and sharp. That's good. Okay, so we've got this nice sharp edge that's right here. Now the next thing to do is I'm going to go with a slightly lighter group of colors that are going to have some raw sienna in them. And tell you the other colors here. I'm going to use a Venetian red. It's kind of a warm reddish brown. And we've got a transparent yellow oxide here. Put some of that in there too. And a little bit of sepia.
Can the QOR paints be used together with regular watercolors? Or do
You can use core together. Now they say on the, when you see the literature on them, they'll tell you right there that you can use it with regular watercolor paint. It doesn't work as well with regular watercolor paint because of the way it dries. Core watercolor dries a little differently. So when it dries completely, so far this has just been core, I can come back in here and completely go in with another like wet on wet wash for this. And normally with a regular watercolor, because of how damp the paper still is, you would run the risk of having a back run, a really bad one. With these, you don't. They kind of wait a little bit too long. So if you use a regular watercolor with it, you would probably run the risk of having normal back runs. You'd have to be more careful with it. So I like the fact that this is something that makes watercolor in a way, to me, less forgiving. Now I'm putting down the base color, which is a reddish brown mixture. I told you the three colors I mixed together. Some really dark brown in here too, but there's some black. Sepia, so there's some really, really dark color in here. Lays the paint on fairly quickly, nice and thick right across there, and you can see the paper actually is getting covered up pretty quickly as well.
What kind of paper did you say you're using?
This is a 140 pound cold press Arches watercolor block. I like the block just because I don't have to use a board. You don't have to tape it down. The block is already, you know, holding the paper in place. It's got a nice surface to push against, so you don't have to worry about that either. Okay, so this is nice. This nice rock that's coming forward here. And that's one of the reasons I went with the reddish brown in the foreground rock. The reason for that being is it's a warmer, darker color than the color that's behind there. And so that reddish brown comes forward in front of this bluish black that is in here. Now these colors are not going to stay this way. I am going to cover them with lighter color, but for right now, I'm just putting down the base of these.
So Jeff, do you add water to it or just the paint?
Yes, I actually do. I have a little bucket of water down here, and I dip my palette knife into the water so I can keep the paint fairly fluid when it's going down here. But again, this blade is very thin.
Okay.
I can use a fatter palette knife, and I do have another big one here. That can cover the area, surface area, much, much quicker. But this is actually coming along pretty well, pretty fast. Okay, just because I want to show you what I'm going to do with this now, I put in some of the darker areas into this brown, and already, even if I can see it just in a small area up here, but you can see it already looks like rock. It already looks like there's water back there as well. You can do this technique with just about any kind of watercolor paint, but like I said, you can use acrylic to do this as well. Okay, so I'm going to take some raw sienna. And I'm just going to take some of the raw sienna directly on the knife. You can see how that separates off. Now there looks like there's a top to that rock form that's there. Now that's not going to be the lightest version even now. There's going to be, I can add some Chinese white to this, raw sienna. You can even go back and use a brush on top of this as you're going along. So let's take some more of that raw sienna, and I'm going to take a little bit of, I think, Chinese white. And normally, as you know from regular watercolor, you don't use white. But when you're doing it with a knife, you can. So you can start with dark colors, and you can use white too.
I'm wondering whether watercolor purists would consider this watercolor, since they usually think of watercolor as transparent media.
Yeah. And this is going on much more opaque, almost like an acrylic.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, this is the first time I'm seeing this knife watercolor.
Yeah, and so you see it, it's starting to look very much almost like an acrylic painting as it's going forward here. Now, the cool thing is with these kinds of paints, you have a huge palette of color. with watercolors. Certainly greater than acrylic. Particularly if you decide to incorporate Daniel Smith, you can. I have successfully used Daniel Smith with core watercolor when I've been using a knife. As long as I just use it sparingly, it doesn't really. Okay, so I'm starting to like those rocks very much. They're coming together pretty good. And then I can move down lower still, right down in this area right here. It gets to be very shadowy because right here, there's a break where there's going to be water. So I'm going to go back to those very, very super dark colors that I started in the beginning with that had a lot of blue and black in those colors and go into the shadow areas.
Jeff, have you used the canvas that is coming for watercolor?
I have used watercolor canvas. In fact, I have a good story about that. Years ago when UA in San Jose was still open,
Yeah.
Tom Lynch used to come there every single year to do watercolor workshops. And believe it or not, I first learned watercolor not in college, but from watching Tom Lynch on television. That's where I first learned watercolor. And so it was really a thrill for me years later that the first year that he came to do a workshop there, he was there because he was doing, the reason he was going out and doing it is Fredericks had created a watercolor canvas. And up until then, there was a huge area of the country where Tom's work was not shown because it was too hot, notably the Southwest. Nobody wanted to display watercolors in a lot of those really hot areas because of the glass and the environmental things to keep the temperatures and everything just so you wouldn't reactivate or harm the watercolor in any way. So it was really one of those things where he had a really tough time getting sales out of the area. Watercolor canvas allowed him to kind of get away from all of that. And what I mean by that is he could do a painting on canvas in watercolor, and when it was all done, put 3 layers of varnish on the painting. And he used Kmart varnish or the golden UVLS varnish that you could use, and he would put 3 coats on it. He would use a beginning coat, a middle coat, and then he would use a finishing coat. So, and he would do them horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. So there wasn't any broken areas where there was not varnish. Did them all that way. And once that was done, you could throw a cup of water at a watercolor painting that was on canvas that's been varnished, or sit it out in the sun. You wouldn't have any fading, you wouldn't have any cracking, anything like that. It actually stayed put. That isn't sales pitch. That is something where I was actually going to do a show, and the demo that I did with Tom Lynch was on a watercolor canvas panel. And so I didn't put it up to display for sale or anything. I hung it up in the hottest part on the back of my display wall, so it was in full sun all day. Just let it cook. No glass, no mat, no nothing, because it was right on a panel. And just let it sit there all day. It survived, it did not fade, it did not crack, and I still have that painting. So it is something that is nice, particularly if you don't want to use glass, don't want to use matting, you can use watercolor canvas, and that'll work really, really well. Okay, so right down at the very bottom here, we're going to keep it really dark because that's when the water hits it.
Which one do you prefer?
I still like watercolor paper myself, but I do use watercolor canvas occasionally. And I will tell you something else too. if you can't find a watercolor canvas, you have difficulty getting it. If you go to go get a masterpiece canvas, and it's called a Satin canvas, which I think has a green border on it. Satin canvas, the thinner ones. Whatever gesso they use on that will actually accept watercolor. It flocculates more, so it looks a little bit sandier, but it works really, really well. And you can do some really nice work on masterpiece Satin canvas, just regular canvas. Okay, so this is coming along nicely too. Now this background color, this rock, like I said here, isn't going to stay black. I'm going to scumble, meaning I'm going to let some of the black peek through. But this isn't all going to stay black back here. I'm going to scrape some lighter color over the top of this in places. I still want it to be darker and cooler. So I've got more blue in with that. That's it. You can see that lighter with that bluer underpainting. When I'm putting on that lighter whitish color, it registers a light gray. And it looks like a cooler gray, and so it still falls back, but it's not as stark as the super black that was up there. Really haven't added any new colors yet. I've just stuck with this limited palette, and that's really a good idea when you're painting anyway. Once you get your palette down and say, okay, this is what I'm going to be using, then you should kind of stick with that and just try to repeat the colors throughout your painting, do different values, different intensities of them, do tints and tones. In other words, add a little bit of white to some of those, or add a little bit of black to some of those to tint and tone those colors. But don't introduce a lot of brand new color. If you do that, every new color that you introduce, you now have to balance that against all the existing colors that you have. And it becomes a nightmare sometimes to try to balance painting. Okay, I'm digging my rocks. Now you can use this for doing like I'm showing you right now, woody or rocky shorelines, ocean, that sort of stuff. You can do that, but you can also flowers, individual flowers, and plants of different kinds. I've got another piece here that I wanted to show you guys. This is another knife painted watercolor that was from Monterey, and that started off with a dark wash up near the top, and then I toned it all the way down to almost like a green at the bottom, let it dry, and then everything else on top of that is palette knife. And it looks very much like an acrylic, but you can do something like this where it's really floral, or you can do rocks like this as well. Okay, so I have water that's going to be down in here, and I think I'm going to do manganese, which is my favorite tube blue, by the way. I love manganese blue.
So would it be accurate to say that an advantage of this, using this kind of paint and this technique, would be an advantage over doing it with acrylic, say, would be that acrylic, when it dries, it's dry. That's the end of that. Whereas with this, you could always reactivate it with some maybe a spritz of water.
Yeah, it can reactivate just like watercolor, but as I started to say, it does not activate as quickly as regular watercolor. The Aquazol actually causes it to activate a bit slower. And because of that, I really do think, this is my own opinion, but I really think that it minimizes those nasty backgrounds you have sometimes. That you have to, you know, in regular watercolor, you get a background in the wrong place and say, okay, it's going to be a tumbleweed. Or I'm going to put a bear in it now because you can't get the background out of there. You have to come up with some way to use it. But with this, you don't run into that as much.
So this doesn't get like a skin on top of it like acrylic would if it was watered down or anything.
Well, when you're on the palette, and that's what I started to say to begin with to show you, is when you're putting core watercolor on your palette, it will, when it dries, it will skin. You'll get this really light skin that's on the palette, and you're going, oh no, it's skinned over, it's going to dry. No, it's not. It's, you know, it is dry, but it will reactivate. Just all you have to do is get it wet, and you won't be taking like a little chunk of paint with you or anything like that. It'll dissolve right back into normal watercolor paint.
Cool.
Yeah, I really like this because it gives you the best of both worlds. It allows you to use traditional watercolor techniques, but it also allows you to use acrylic painting techniques and, you know, your palette knife and so on too. These rocks and now the water that are in front of the rocks, I'm really liking that too. It's got a really nice transitional water here. And now the last little bit is there's some foreground rocks that are here in this channel. And so I can bring, there's a couple of things that I can do. What I might do is take some of that water and bring it forward a little bit more. Now again, this is manganese and a little bit of sepia together. And I'm using a really loose round brush here for the water. Letting some of the paper show through it. And I'm just going to let it sit for a second there. And while that is going on, I can block in the rest of the rocks. Once that's done, then I can come in where I want to is I can take some titanium white and some Chinese white with a small knife, and I can put in little froth lines that are in the ocean. Those little froth lines that kind of smash up against the rocks and everything, or in this area here where it's really white, I can touch in some white right against the edge of this where the water looks like it's going to smash up to the rocks.
So Jeff, how long? Right.
You figure we've done, this is what, been 20 minutes, 25 minutes so far with talking, and this 11 by 15 painting is almost completely, almost the entire surface has been covered already, which is pretty cool. You can actually paint this way really fast. The knife allows you to get into that paint, into that paper, that canvas, whatever you're using. You can cover the surface really, really fast. If this was a knife painted like acrylic on 18 by 24, you can do an entire painting like that in a couple of hours by using a knife, just by using a knife. Because the way it allows you to lay down the paint. This is coming out really nice so far.
Jeff,
I
this
don't know if you
might
guys can see from there, but it's looking pretty cool.
It's very nice already. Sheetal, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a very basic question because I've never used palette knife ever in my painting. What's the difference between palette knife and painting knife?
Okay, a palette knife and a painting knife are the exact same thing. In other words, they're both designed to mix paint. The difference between a painting knife and a palette knife, so all painting knives are also palette knives, but all palette knives are not painting knives. And what that has to do with the flexibility of the blades. So these ones that I'm using, these are RGM. So they are palette knives. They're for mixing color, but they're also painting knives. The blades are
I'm not able to
flexible.
see the knife.
We can't see you. We can't see
Can
the
you
knife.
get it to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so these are very flexible. So they move back and forth when you're using them and everything. You mix paint with them. So they're, you know, like I said, all painting knives are palette knives, but not all palette knives are painting knives. And the regular palette knife, there's no flexibility.
So palette.
It's very rigid, and it doesn't have the same spring.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it.
So, you know, when you're using this knife, there's a certain amount of spring to it, and it bounces back and forth and actually responds to your hand, whereas a regular palette knife is a lot more rigid. You can paint with a palette knife, but it's more difficult because it doesn't flex as much. So you get these big, broad strokes that are in there. They're a bit more difficult to handle, whereas a painting / palette knife is much, much easier because the blade moves.
How do we actually, I don't think when we do this, we'll get this style. So we don't, I don't know how the color would be spreading when we take the color in the knife. So is there any specific techniques there is to spread the paint?
Well, always when you're doing a painting, you know, you should work on, and I did tonight, I had my colors laid out, at least the ones that I thought I was going to use tonight. But as far as putting them down, you have to think it's the same thing in terms of doing a regular watercolor painting. Now, the difference is with watercolor, you have to be more concerned about mud and keeping the colors transparent and everything, right? And so you have to be very careful. You go from light to dark, and you're strictly coming up with transparent washes. Let me show you this. This one, I think if I can get this to you, I can show it to you really quickly. Let's see. Shorebird's Pond. Okay, so I should be able to share another painting with you here. And this is using the exact same paint that I've been showing you with a knife. This is a traditional watercolor using the exact same paint, core watercolor. This is a traditional watercolor. This is plein air. I painted this outside in front of this pond in Monterey, saltwater pond that's there. It's called Shorebird's Pond. And so this was done just with traditional watercolor. And again, trying to keep the washes clean and crisp, pale, cool colors in the back, warmer, dark colors in front. Trying not to get mud, letting everything dry, letting the paper show through here and there, having all of the specific detail close to you. Very, very traditional watercolor techniques. It has that radiance and glow from the paper showing through this. And that's what you have to do when you're thinking in terms of a traditional watercolor. You have to think about letting the washes dry and progressing the colors the right way. You do the same thing here. The difference is if you screw up, you can paint over it. With watercolor, with a traditional wash, you may not be able to paint over it depending on what kind of painting you're doing. If it's something that's really delicate, you go, oh no, I've messed this up. You may not be able to salvage it. You may have to, change it in some way, have it be something other than what you had intended. With this, it's a bit more forgiving. If you screw up someplace and say, hey, you know what? I can go ahead and I can do this. I can go ahead and block in a different color here. I can cover up that mistake with a palette knife. Now, you still want to let, again, certain things with watercolor are true throughout. You want to let some of that paper peek through. You really do. That is a kind of a tried and true traditional watercolor technique. You always want to let some of the white of the paper show through, always.
Jeff, have you tried mixing watercolor in the knife painting with the acrylics?
I haven't done watercolor with acrylic together, but I did do this years ago when I was recovering, when I was in the hospital. It'll be 7 years now that I had that heart attack. I can't believe it's been that long. Been fortunately very healthy since, but I was at home stuck on a couch, the end of a couch, for a very, very long time. And I had my wife get me a whole bunch of little teeny tiny canvases, and I got some acrylic glazing liquid by Golden. And I got the satin glazing liquid. So the satin glazing liquid's really cool. It doesn't have a really glossy feel to it. Doesn't have a really dark feel to, or a matte feel to it. It has a really nice kind of a satiny, almost an oil paint feel to it. It really does. And so what I did is I took that varnish or that binder or that medium and the glazing liquid, and I mixed it in with some watercolor paint. So in other words, I used Golden acrylic glazing liquid with watercolor paint. In effect, turning the watercolor paint into an acrylic. That's what ended up happening when I did that. The water solubility went away the same way. I mean, it basically became a plastic paint when I did that. So it became a little acrylic paint. Now, what was the advantage? The advantage was I had a lot more color. I had tons of tubes of watercolor. So I just used the watercolor along with acrylic glazing liquid, and I did a whole bunch of small canvases that way where I used the watercolor just like I would normally use watercolor, only I mixed it with glazing liquid. And so in effect, I had these beautiful transparent acrylic paintings by using an acrylic medium with a watercolor paint. You can do that. You can go ahead and, take any of your traditional watercolors, give it a try. Grab some, buy yourself some acrylic medium if you don't have it, some glazing liquid or matte medium or gloss medium, whichever you prefer, and have a little container of it next to your rinse water when you're painting in watercolor. And then before you dip your brush into the paint, go ahead and dip your brush into the medium. Yeah, cool. This is starting to come along really nice.
Yeah, it's looking wonderful.
And I love this technique because you can do something very quickly with it. It is kind of an exuberant technique too, because it really doesn't let you fiddle. You kind of have to just go for it and get the color down and hope you got the right colors down too.
You moved the light there. I don't, whenever I have tried like that, I never get the colors like that. So I just, so.
A lot of times what I do is I will practice, particularly if I'm doing an acrylic painting, I'll have a piece of paper next to where my canvas is, and I'll take 2 or 3 different palette knives and get stuff on them and just, brush it down onto the paper to see what the knife is going to look like when I use it. Mm-hmm. Is it going to be short, choppy? Is it going to be wider? I haven't used my really big palette knife here like I would normally use for acrylic. This is a painting knife, but it's a really big one. But it covers a lot more surface area here. It is much, much bigger and will cover an area really, really fast, particularly if it's on canvas. But this, with this larger knife, I was able to close out the edge of this really, really easily by having the water here. Now there's a little rock in between here where it'd be kind of like this. And there's going to be some water around it too. So I'll let that sit in there because I'm going to do some wash around this water here. But while that's happening, I can come back in over here and put in some darker areas in this rock. Again, using that blue, black, brown mixture that I did at the very beginning. If you notice, I haven't really added a whole lot of new paint. Working from the exact same, you saw those 3 little dollops that I squirted out right at the beginning. I'm using those same 3 dollops of paint here. I have not added any more paint. That's something else too when you're doing this with a watercolor. The watercolor, when it dries on your palette paper or your palette, if it's acrylic, it's plastic, you're done, you have to squirt out more paint. With watercolor, all you have to do is get your palette paper wet again, just mist it, and you got paint again. And so you don't need to squirt out any more paint. So all those little tiny dollops of paint that I showed you, and this whole painting has been done just using those dollops of paint. I haven't had to use a whole lot of color. The other thing that's really interesting for me is when I'm doing something like this, I've had to learn to teach myself to paint off to the side. You know, normally when you're in front, when you're doing a painting, you're right in front of it, you're looking down at it and everything. But when you're demoing or even teaching a class, it's off to the side. So I'm sitting off to the right of this and painting it with my right hand, kind of across my body. So it is an unusual way of painting because you're not used to doing that. But you kind of have to almost if you're going to be doing it digitally. I've started to teach myself to do that by
This has become normal.
do this across body.
Yeah.
And the extra cameras help and everything too, but still in the other classes when I'm the host, I've got, you know, the whole thing, you can see it a lot better, but I'm still off to the side. I'm not right in front of it. And so I always have to, when I'm all done for them, say, hey, yeah, it's done. I need to take the time to actually see it up close at a normal perspective angle because it's facing the station point here from my colors have been off to the side. I'm looking everything at an angle like this. It may not look the way I want it to when I stand in front of it. So I may have to make some adjustments just because of how I was sitting and painting when I was doing this. I may need to make some little adjustments later, and that's okay.
So is this wrong for you now with the Zoom meetings? So you don't get to do it in front of the students. So you have to get used to this style of doing it from the side. So
Yeah, see with my the other class, I'm, you know, big screen obviously so you can see it closer. But then the one I do at the Pacific Art League, it is through their Zoom account and their Zoom recording. So if somebody wants to see the class, they can call the Pacific Art League. But I can also download a physical copy. Now that's a lot of gigabytes.
yeah.
A normal 2-hour class is anywhere from 2.1 to 2.9 gigabytes.
Yeah.
That's a lot of memory. You don't want to keep it on your computer either. So what I've been doing is the ones that I thought turned out really well as far as class and demonstration and questions and everything, I downloaded it and then burned a DVD on there. And so I can, and then once it was on DVD, it was all nice and clear and I could see it all. I took it off the computer.
Yeah, you can put it on the YouTube if you're okay with putting on cloud and make it unlisted if you want to, if you don't want to show it to public. can just put it in your private.
The problem is with the cloud, particularly if it's through Zoom, I don't know what it's like for Ring Central, but with Zoom, they only allow you 1 gig of memory
Oh yeah.
on the cloud, unless you want to pay like $50 a month to get the extra memory. And then they'll go ahead and give you the extra memory. But the memory they give you is more memory than you're going to use, even if you recorded everything. So it just, to me, it's not worth the extra money to do that. It's just easier to burn the DVD.
Yeah. But you can put it in the YouTube account. Try with a personal, like not to show, like with a private link.
Sure.
So that like if you don't want to do the DVD, so you can watch anytime on YouTube. So
And it lets me see how I communicate to people, whether or not I'm, repeating the same stuff or telling stupid stories too much or whatever it is. It's really helpful to be able to look back on those.
Yeah. Nice. Let me go get my charger.
There's a lot of stuff going on right now. I saw, Hottie's got in that exhibit, and I know Denise is in a couple of exhibits and everything like that too. I just got, I'm one of 10 artists that's been selected for a mural project in the SOFA district in San Jose. They haven't started the project yet, but I did submit the sketches. And it's basically, believe it or not, going to be all florals. And they wanted native plants, but not native California plants, native plants based on your ancestry.
Oh.
So you had to research plants from where your family comes from and come up with 2 or 3. And then the other thing was these plants had to have a backstory. They had to have something interesting about them to be accepted. So it had to be a plant from wherever your ancestry comes from, and it had to be something that, like arnica, that was used in Europe, in Germany, and so on, to fight off werewolves. They used it like so those sorts of things, and then decide whether or not they're going to accept it. So I have that's going on. The actual project hasn't started yet, but probably pretty soon. And then I got scheduled for another one of the Phantom Gallery's art boxes. I have a client that wanted an agricultural theme, and I don't know what it is, but when their agricultural theme, Sherry calls me and say, hey, I've got another group that wants something farm related done. I've done 2 already in the South Bay, and so I'm going to be doing a 3rd one. I just need to submit the sketches for those and have them accepted, and I can get started on those. And those are both nice paying jobs too when I get around to pinning them. Plus, I'm in the middle of a commission too. I have a lady, it's a really good friend we met years ago on Facebook. She and her husband and her kids, they're all of Irish descent and really like the mythology and everything that goes along with Ireland. And so she commissioned me to do New Grange Mound in Ireland, which is a passage tomb. It's a big, huge, from the back it just looks like a hill, but there's a row of these big monolithic stones from the back, but on the front, they get broken up into smaller and smaller stones that have spirals woven into them, and the opening is right in front there too. And they're set up to where the sunlight from the summer solstice comes in and lights up the back of the tomb. There's a specific spot on the wall that lights up on the summer solstice every single year. It's a very interesting, mystical sort of a place. There's these really interesting stone outbuildings and some monolithic stones that are around it and everything too. So that's what she wanted, what she commissioned me for. So I did a lot of research and came up with different elements of it. So the scene that I sketched and painted is not one that you'd be able to see going to New Grange, because I used different elements from different angles from around that area and put it all in the same painting.
Nice.
But it's turned out really, really nice so far. I'm very happy with it. It's got that really kind of weird, kind of light to it, you know, eerie sort of mystical light that's going along with it. It's coming along really well. I'm coming down to just finishing up the foreground outbuildings, and I've got a single Celtic cross I have to paint in the front of it, and then it'll be all done.
Oh, good. How big is it?
Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to throw in a little bit more of the water.
So Jeff, yeah, we can go for another 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just about done for this right now because I have to let it dry for a little bit more before I can do too much more to it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty close to being done. It's not that far away from being done now. And of course, I have to knife paint in some of the color too.
So how much time do
The
you
white.
need for drying before you start the next layer?
I will probably let this, well, first I've got some white froth that I have to knife in there too, but I would let it sit overnight before I tried to varnish it. Let's go 24 hours. Probably not necessarily, but I would because the paint's a little thicker and I want to make sure that it's dry. But this is coming along very nice. All I have to do is knife in some of the white froth here and there, and maybe some of the plants on the rocks here and there too. Maybe a few more little scraping details or something. But for the amount of time, it actually came off really, really well. I think it's off to a really nice start.
Very nice.
And I will show it to you as soon as I finish. I'll post it, I promise.
So please send a picture once you complete it so that we can add it to our Facebook page. Also, I'll put it in, and I share your video in YouTube, so I'll add the completed picture as the
Fantastic.
Okay, great.
So I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, very much. Maybe all of you can unmute yourself and say.
Yes,
Yes, it was wonderful.
It was an awesome demo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was excellent.
Thank you very much.
So which watercolor did you use, if you can share with us?
Yeah, can you show the tube? I think we couldn't see the tubes.
Yeah, the tube was Core Watercolor, QOR.
Oh, QOR. Okay.
By Golden, and that's pretty much what I use for everything. There was one, the raw sienna I used was Daniel Smith, but I only used a little tiny bit of it. Everything else was Core, and that's just because Core doesn't shrink and crack as much. You can use Daniel Smith with it. Those other two paintings that I showed you have Daniel Smith mixed in with them as well.
Good.
It's just another great way to use watercolor. For those of you who do watercolor, this is a good way to do it, and you don't have to worry about the stuff that you normally have to worry about with a traditional watercolor.
So when the light goes
It gives you an out. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So,
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
It was nice.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.